After the flood, a graveyard planet, fossil fuels and fossil fuels, phosphates and phosphates. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, but also on their heads, backs, stomachs, and feet, and etc. Of all that lived prior to the flood, the flora and the fauna, we have burned their bodies and their remains for thousands of years for fuel. We utilize them in our cars and in our machines. Their detritus in their current forms are used to build houses and walls and streets and as binding agents. The mountains that we climb are made up of the remains of microscopically dead animals. The chemicals that make up the bones of the pre-flood living are used to fertilize our crops and our gardens, and their remains may even be worn around our necks or on our fingers as jewelry. This planet is a vast graveyard, and the life that existed before the flood is buried or entombed all around us, and are mute witnesses of the Genesis account. The Genesis account. Now the flood was on the earth for 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. Genesis 7. Information on the flood from the fossil record. During this period of time, most major animal groups and body plans appear for the very first time in the fossil record, suddenly, without predecessors in a relatively short period of time. Of great worry to Darwin, the explanation of this sudden apparent explosion persists as a source of numerous major debates in paleobiology. Darwinists and scientists call this period the Cambrian explosion. Christians, Bible believers, and creationists call this period creation. This extinction event was the Earth's most severe, and according to science, up to 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species became extinct. It is the only known mass extinction of insects, and some 57% of all families and 83% of all genera were killed. Because so much biodiversity was lost, the recovery of life on Earth took significantly longer than after other extinction events. And this event has been described as the mother of all mass extinctions. Darwinists and science call this period the Great Dying, or the Permian extinction. Christians, creationists, Bible believers call this period the flood of Noah. Where did the water come from? Well, 70% of the Earth's surface is currently covered by water. This is unique because no other planet in the known universe has liquid water on its surface. A 1997 article in New Scientist explains that there could be as much as between 5 and 30 oceans worth of water below the Earth's surface. This is important to the Genesis account because it explains that water comes from above in the form of rain and below from the fountains of the great deep. In 2007, the Beijing anomaly was discovered. This is a huge bulge under Asia, and it could hold as much as water as the Arctic Ocean holds, according to scientists who did the calculations. The links are here provided. Of the 30% of the Earth's surface not covered by water, 70% of that surface is sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock, by definition, are laid down as sediments by moving fluids and are made up of pieces of rock or other material which existed somewhere else and which were eroded or dissolved and redeposited in their current locations. According to Stein and Rowe, textbook authors and award-winning teachers, effective fossilization usually depends on having hard body parts such as bones or shells and being buried immediately after death. The work of predators and scavengers and the weathering effects of rain, heat, cold, and wind often serve to destroy most or all of an organism before this burial can take place, and then the subsequent fossilization. Fossilization usually requires at least one other important element, and that is water. The staff recently of the Live Science wrote about a phenomenon that's been known and puzzled paleobiologists for some time, and that's that dinosaurs and other mammals and other fast respiratory animals appear to have died agonizing deaths when looking at their fossils. Fossilized dinosaurs often have wide open mouths, heads thrown back, and tails that curve toward the head. And paleontologists have long assumed that dinosaurs died in water, and that the currents drifted the bones into that position, or the rigor mortis or drying muscles or tendons led to all fossils having this similar characteristics. But recently a veterinarian studied some of these fossils and came to the conclusion that their posture was consistent with brain damage and asphyxiation. We should point out that this brain damage and asphyxiation in this posture is consistent with drowning. The beautiful Andes Mountains. You know, when considering pre-flood remains, the group that actually represents the largest mass of corpses is the microscopic animal life. In Microbes and Man, the 4th edition, it confirmed that the mass of microscopic life has been calculated to be on the order of 5 to 25 times the mass of all other animal life. This is maybe not to be expected. The 17th century, Van Leeuwenhoek invented or refined the microscope, and he had a microscope that could magnify 270 times. And people started looking through these microscopes to look at things that they'd never seen before. Startling and almost incredible as the assertion may appear to some, it is nonetheless a fact established beyond all question by the aid of the microscope that some of the most gigantic mountain ranges, such as the mighty Andes towering into space 25,200 feet above sea level, and also the massive limestone rocks and the sand that covers the boundless deserts and the soil of many widely extended plains, are principally composed of portions of microscopic animalcules. Dr. Buckland has said that the remains of such minute animals have added much more to the massive materials which compose the exterior crust of the globe than the bones of elephants, hippopotami, and whales. Strange Freaks of Nature, October 1907. What kind of catastrophe would pile up microscopic animals to a height of 25,000 feet in mountain ranges around the world? Buckland found that these marine corals actually the silica served as a binding agent in sedimentary rocks all around the world. Chalk is a soft, white, porous sedimentary rock, and it's a form of limestone. And science simply says that it's primarily made up of calcite, without acknowledging that the source of calcite is primarily organic in nature. Let the reader mentally follow the track which we shall point out to him, and endeavor, if he can, to estimate the cubic contents of such a mass of solid matter, if he would gain an idea of the importance of microscopic life in the work of creation. Commencing at Dover or Beachy Head, follow the course of the North or the South Downs up to their point of junction in East Hampshire, where they are joined by another branch of similar downs commencing near Weymouth. These 3 chalk ranges enclose an area which includes all of the north of Hampshire and the larger portion of the south of Wiltshire. Yet this is not all. By the Marlborough Downs, and by the Ilsley Downs, and the White Horse Hills, and the chalk runs into Oxfordshire, and continues with some interruptions through Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire, and Cambridgeshire into Norfolk. Neither is this all. The lofty cliffs between Cromer and Huntington, the wolds of Lincolnshire, and those of Yorkshire are all chalk. Southward, let the tourist say how much of the Isle of Wight is chalk. Chalk along the coast, chalk in the hills, chalk in the valleys. Chalk forms the Inkpen Beacon, Wilts, 1,000 feet above sea. Chalk forms the needles crumbling to it. All is chalk, nothing but chalk, chalk and flints. Yet stay, take up a pinch of the white mass, lay a particle of it no bigger than a pin's head on the field of a microscope, and what a startling spectacle discloses itself. The dust is thick with organized forms. All is shells and corals. The needles are shells and corals. The downs are shells and corals. Underneath the thin green tuft of the wolds lie shells and corals. The great Humber rolls over shells and corals. The white walls of England are shells and coral. Shakespeare's cliff is shells and corals. The waters which sweep around Margate, Ramsgate, and Dover, white as milk, are all full remains of the shells and corals. 1,000,000 of shells and corals lie in a cubic inch of chalk. What inconceivable millions in a hill, and what in the whole range! And these of the most beautiful forms, all once replete with life. How large a part of England's southern and western coast is made up of individual beings more minute than a pin's point. These minute beings, and the idea is still more strange, approach us in our homes. Do we whitewash our ceilings? It is with shells and corals. Shells and corals, it is said, come to us in our London milk. Shells and corals form the beautiful glazing of a lady's card, and oftentimes the ornamental covering of her work boxes or show books. The doctor sends the shells and corals in his physics, and the confectioner, as we are told, in his comfites. The microscope, skillfully applied, makes all of this plain, and reveals to us in a language appreciable to the eye, though barely capable of being fully comprehended by the mind, how vast a share in the operations of nature the Creator has assigned to beings so infinitesimally minute. William Buckland, The Living Age, Volume 28, The Microscope and Its Wonders. In an article in the March 26, 1892 New York Times, entitled A Wilderness of Bones, where elephants, tigers, and mastodons lie buried, the New York Times went on about phosphates in Florida. Nearly half of Florida is marked out as a phosphate bed. The phosphate lands begin in the northern tier of counties. Tallahassee, the capital, is the center of a great deposit. In a general way, the deposits begin at the mouth of the Apalachicola River and circle around the northwest and eastward, underlying Tallahassee, Monticello, and Live Oak, and then running southward all on the west side of the state, through Ocala and Barstow, all the way down to Punta Rasa. The bone phosphate of lime is nothing more nor less than the decomposed bones, or sometimes the guano, of long dead animals and birds, solidified into soft rock. Where did so many bones come from? It looks as though at some prehistoric time all the beasts of the field, and all the birds of the air, and all the leviathans of the deep had gathered for some unknown purpose in the state of Florida, and had been overtaken by some great calamity, and left their bones there. The Karoo Boneyards of South Africa is an immense volume of sandstone and shale, up to 20,000 feet thick, that contains an estimated 800 billion vertebrate fossils, mostly of swamp-dwelling reptiles. And it's a location that uniformism and Darwinism can't cope with, but is consistent with the flood account. Massive fossil boneyards are located worldwide. Massive fossil graveyards of dinosaurs still exist in other locations besides the Karoo Boneyard that we just talked about. The Morrison Beds in North America, the dinosaur beds in Montana, the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, the Dakotas in China and Colorado, Utah, Africa, etc., etc. And they contain literally millions of dinosaur fossils piled together in tremendous heaps. 10,000 hadrosaurs were found on Egg Mountain, Montana alone, jumbled together in what appears to have been a mass death. The flood produced the Sicilian hippopotamus beds, the fossils of which are so extensive that they are today mined as a source of charcoal. They produced the great mammal beds of the Rockies, the dinosaur beds of the Black Hills and the Rockies, as well as the Gobi Desert, the fish beds of the Scottish Dovian stratum, the Baltic amber beds, the Agate Spring Quarry in Nebraska, and hundreds of more. Dr. Frank Hibben, who's a professor of archaeology back in the 40s, set out to an expedition to Alaska. Actually, he was looking for human remains. But the evidence of the violence of nature combined with the stench of rotting carcasses was what he found, and it was staggering. The ice fields containing these remains stretched out for hundreds of miles in every direction. Trees and animals, layers of peat mosses, twisted and mangled together like some giant mixer had jumbled them some 10,000 years ago and then froze them to a solid mass, is how he reported on it. The picture in Siberia and northern Europe is no different. Just north of Siberia, whole islands are formed of the bones of Pleistocene animals swept northward from the continent into the frigid waters of the Arctic Ocean. And it's been estimated that some 10 million animals lay buried along the rivers of northern Siberia. The end, people. I need a glass of water. Copyright 2011 by Chris Parker and Saint.com. Thanks for your kind attention.